You're listening to the Saving Elephants podcast, a place where millennials express and defend their conservative values in hopes of restoring the Republican Party. Join us as we reignite conservatism for millennials.
I'm one of those fortunate millennials who actually owns my own home. And I recognize that certainly for our generation, this can't be said for nearly as many of us as we probably would have expected when we were much younger growing up. Now, for those of us millennials who do own our own homes, we have a really good incentive to invest in them, to make them accrue in value over time. We have a good reason to hope that we could sell the home we're in eventually at a profit and move into an even nicer home. And for those millennials and younger Americans who do not yet own their own home, and possibly see no way in the near or even distant future to do so, it seems my friends in that group talk endlessly about how difficult the housing market is these days, how expensive things are, how even if there's plenty of houses out there, there's just nothing in a reasonable range for someone who wants to own a home for the first time. Well, to be honest, it never really crossed my mind before that Americans who are homeowners and Americans who one day hope to be homeowners are really working at cross purposes with each other. I mean, here I am with my fellow homeowners trying to raise the price of homes so that it would be a good investment for me, while everyone else left outside hoping to become homeowners wants housing to not be so expensive. Well, even though I hadn't put a lot of thought into this, my guest in this episode, Chuck Marohn, president and founder of Strong Towns, has put a lot of thought into this. In fact, he's written not only multiple blog posts, but an entire book about, actually a series of books about this very problem. His most recent one, the one we will be talking about the most today, Escaping the Housing Trap. Chuck defines the trap very simply. He says, we need housing prices to fall. We also cannot afford for them to fall. Thus, we are trapped. There is no way out of this trap that does not involve a painful correction. Housing prices are unattainably high for millions of Americans, threatening the stability and prosperity of our lives. But anything more than a modest fall in home prices in the near term represents a threat to the banking system and the entire U.S. economy. I like Chuck's approach to a lot of the problems that we have in housing and the way we develop cities and all kinds of national issues. I think you will find it very Burkean, very reticent to hop on board large-scale plans of how we might, air quotes, solve the housing market crisis or solve the U.S. economy. So with that, I give you my conversation with Chuck Marohn.
You're listening to the Saving Elephants Show.
Chuck, it's good to have you back for, I guess, what would be a third time on the Saving
Is it really?
podcast. It's been a third time. Yeah, we had an introductory conversation the first time about your work with Strong Towns, and then we had a very interesting conversation about reparations from a, say, conservative lens. And you have been busy writing many books in the meanwhile. The one we'll be discussing today, of course, Escaping the Housing Trap. And I wanted to start off with some level setting here because there seems to be a through line in a lot of your work that there is such a paradigm shift in how we do housing since World War II and the kind of suburban era that most of us, well, I suppose nobody was really alive, or very few would be alive to remember what the pre-World War II housing structure looked like, but we don't even have a concept for what that world looks like, whereas it sounds like you're painting this look. Since the dawn of time up until pretty recently, we used to do housing a little different. So I'm wondering, can we start here? How did we do housing different?
Yeah, wow, it's really important, I think, to understand this because we live in this world that we think is very normal. And in the in the context of human history, especially like political cultural history, post-World War II is such an aberration. It's such a weird period of time. So a lot of the book, I focused 3 chapters on finance. And in the first one of those, I really wanted people to get a sense of how we financed homes differently pre-Great Depression. Because when we think of buying a home today, you think of getting a 30-year mortgage. It seems very normal. You go to the bank, there's a secondary market. the local bank doesn't hold your loan, it gets sold off, it gets bundled, all this stuff. There's a sense of like, well, that's what it's always been like, and it absolutely is not. If you were going to buy a loan or buy a house before the Great Depression, and you were going to finance it, you had to have 50% down payment. You had to put a lot of cash down. And the reason is because you were getting that loan from a local bank. And the local bank was, we can think of like the scene in It's a Wonderful Life where like your money's in this house and your money's in that. And that was literally what it was. We were, pooling our money in a local bank, and the local bank was lending it out to our neighbors and the people around us. And so the local bank, had to be a secure source of your savings. They were not going to be taking a lot of risk. If you were going to borrow money from them, they wanted a lot of skin in the game. So they wanted a 50% down payment. The second thing that would have been radically different is they would have given you a loan that would have been 3 years, 4 year, 5 year loan. It would have been an interest only loan. And at the end, you would have had a balloon payment. And we can look at that and say, well, that seems really bizarre. But the reality is they could not take, as a local bank with your money, long-term interest rate risk. If interest rates fluctuated, if inflation fluctuated, and they had to, in a sense, like reset, you think about like a mortgage written in our time, 10 years ago, it'd be at 3%. Now you get a mortgage, it's going to be at 7%. If you're the bank, you're lending out at different rates, and you're borrowing at different rates. But the borrowing is very short term because it's from depositors. A bank, particularly in that day and age, borrowed money from depositors. The depositor can come and get their money anytime they want. So it's like a very fickle relationship. If interest rates go way up, the borrower, the people who are depositing money in your bank, your depositors, they're going to demand higher interest rates. And if you have these long-term mortgage products at a low interest rate, all of a sudden the bank is losing money. Having a short-term, 3-year, 4-year, 5-year allows the bank to reset their portfolio and stay solvent when the market shifts. And so these things combined basically allowed banks to service the people in their community in a really stable way without endangering the health of the bank. Radically different than what we do today, like radically different.
And one of the things I appreciate about the book is you don't necessarily paint a completely rosy picture of an early era, right? There are some clear advantages to this, but something that, and I thought it was interesting you point this out in the book, is like, I never really thought about that we kind of have this sort of romanticized idea of what old houses looked like, because the only houses that survived, really, that are old are very nice houses, the sort of Victorian era, things that we can say, boy, why can't we build stuff like this again? But in that era, you had a wide variety of houses, some of them not so safe, some of them not so desirable. Well, talk to me about that, because what was the purpose of the variety of housing, and how did that service the market or those who needed housing?
Well, I have a statement in the book, and I point out, because today housing is so expensive. Housing throughout all of human history has been abundant and cheap. There's never been a shortage of housing. The trade-off is that the quality was generally really bad, or there was a lot of really bad housing. So I live in a house that was built in 1914, beginning of World War I. So it's a beautiful house. It's over 100 years old now. It's stood a long time. It was built. I live in this small railroad town in central Minnesota. And so, I'm sure it was built by a railroad-related person who was building here. And it was a very nice house. But most of the houses in our neighborhood are not that old. The houses that would have been built in our neighborhood would have been kind of cheaper, quickly built, maybe more resembled what we would think of as like a shack or a tar paper shack kind of thing, something to get someone housing. And those did not survive. And they didn't survive because they weren't built that great. A lot of times, though, cities of this age, and I talked a lot about this in my first book, this organic way of growing you kind of get something cheap built. You get like a foothold. And then as the city matures, as the place grows, the land goes up in value, things start to shift, and you get more substantial homes built on that same spot. So you might build something cheap to get started, and then you might tear it down and build something else. You might add on to it or fortify it or change it in some way. And so a lot of the housing of this time, was very cheap. It wasn't designed to last. It was designed to, in a sense, get started. We have this nostalgic thing about pulling yourself up by your bootstraps. You literally could start with nothing and end up with something as part of a community that was growing incrementally like this. And so there were lots of opportunities to start small, I guess you would say. We would not appreciate that today because we have more emphasis on the regulation side and making sure that all housing, it meets a certain standard. Because of financing, all housing meets a certain size. Because of insurance, all housing meets a certain set of regulations. But what that does is it makes most starter housing kind of out of reach of people. And that was a very different emphasis. We were less concerned about the quality of house and more concerned about making sure everybody had something.
Yeah, I think of the recent presidential election we went through, where both presidential candidates, and especially Kamala Harris, was talking about the housing crisis in the United States and how we need more housing, and her plans, and not just hers, Trump was doing this too, their plans to essentially ensure that we could house Americans. At no point did I get the sense that either of them had this idea in mind. We're just going to build highly affordable, cheap shacks for people to kind of hang out in. And that, I think we would have considered that inhumane, right? That would have been almost evil. That, yeah, we can solve the housing crisis, but we would give individuals things that we would not consider up to a standard we would want them to be, which I suppose in a certain degree is a mark of our affluence and wealth, and maybe something to be celebrated, that, we think it unthinkable to create these shelters. And that, I guess that's leading me into, as you're describing this is what the world was, post-World War II, or the Great Suburban Experiment. You have this character in the book, J.C. Nichols, the individual that, I don't know if he initiated the phrase, but the permanent prosperity, saying, let us not be content to build up and tear down. Now, this on its surface sounds like a very good sentiment, very sensible, right? Why are we building shacks when we now have the ability to build a neighborhood as it's supposed to evolve into? Let's get to the end point, build it that way, so that we're not having to constantly build something then tear it down, build something and tear it down until we can slowly get enough wealth amassed. And I know this is a big subject, but help me understand how Nichols and this entire mindset shifted us, this idea of permanent prosperity. What was it our suburban experiment was trying to accomplish? And did we accomplish that?
I love this because there is let's say, a progressive moment in the Great Depression where we create like a whole bunch of tools to kind of save the country and all this. And then there is this kind of big business Republican kind of moment after World War II where we're like, all right, we are men of industry. Let's go out and build, we'll use these tools for good. And this was, J.C. Nichols was kind of the epitome of that notion. I think if we try to be generous and put ourselves in their shoes, they look out at our cities, they look out at the places that we had built, and they see this mess of ramshackle shacks and cities, kind of this messy evolution of like you build a neighborhood incrementally and half of building is tearing down and rebuilding. And boy, what a waste of resources. Wouldn't it be nice, because we are very smart people, we are very thoughtful people, we know what we're doing. I'm personifying here. Wouldn't it be better if we just went out and built it perfectly the first time? We know that everybody would like to have their own lot and their own yard and their own home. We know that they would like to have a school in walking distance and a library in walking distance. We know they need a fire department and a police department. And we know they need roads and streets and sewer and water. We can sit down and we can plan out what this should look like. And we know, in a sense, how to build a prosperous place. So forget the like building up and tearing down. Let's just go build it right the first time. Let's make it perfect. And you have to be in awe a little bit of the vision. I mean, I think there's a certain cynicism you can bring to it too when you recognize that the people advocating for this were the real estate agents and the developers and the builders and the people who were, in a sense, going to get large amounts of government backing to go do this capitalist thing of building America, right? But if you bypass that and just look at the vision, there was an immense amount of optimism / hubris of, okay, now we don't have to do this thing in the past, this kind of hard, arduous building of a place. We could just skip all the messiness and get to the end that everybody wants to be in, build it all at once. Yes, we're going to need government support. Yes, we're going to need tons of debt and leverage. Yes, we're going to need 30-year mortgages and people that take on lots of debt. And, yes, we're going to need all that. But we can bypass, in a sense, all the diet and exercise and weightlifting and everything you got to do. And we can just have that like bulky, awesome body at the end. Won't that be great? Go America, let's do it. And yeah, I mean, the thing is, you can look today at the Levittowns and all the things that were built back then that have not sustained themselves well over time. And you can look back and say, wow, we screwed up a lot of stuff. We didn't really know what we were doing. We built a lot of developments that have not aged well, a lot of places that we've abandoned and walked away from, a lot of places that are today like dens of poverty and despair. But at the time, this was the thing. I mean, this was, you've seen those like Disney shows where it's like, America, the future, and and they're like, everybody will have a washing machine. Look at that, the innovation, and it's the guy with the happy voice and the music and the picket fence and the car, and this was like a package of living that we were selling to Americans. These were Americans who had gone through the Great Depression. These are Americans that had gone through World War II. These are Americans that had lived through some of the hardest times that Americans have ever lived through. And now all of a sudden, the thing was like, you can have it all. And seemingly they could. And they went out and did, in a sense. Like, I mean, they had 2 or 3 decades where they did have it all. They just went out and built, and you have this exploding middle class, and you have all of this wealth being created. You have the economy growing. You seemingly have everything just at the tips of your fingers. And it's, we create in this period of time the idea of the American dream as this sense that you can own your own castle. You can have it. It's attainable. If you just work hard, you can experience the American dream. We still have this mythos today, right?
Mm-hmm. So, and you have in the book this concept, I think it makes a lot of sense that, look, a neighborhood that is built all at once is going to fall apart all at once. And maybe even if that's not true, like in an exhaustive sense, you could certainly think of, the neighborhood I left. Neighborhoods tend to age, and they tend to attract new owners that, as the neighborhood is aging, maybe they're not able to keep up with maintenance. And the thing to do, I mean, I see this all the time in cities. It just drives me nuts that we'll build a nice new high rise, and that's where all the affluent businesses go, therefore abandoning the old high rise that just becomes blighted. But I could see how that argument would say, okay, well, clearly this is not a sustainable model if neighborhoods are just going to be built all at once and abandoned all at once. And I'm just curious here because I live in Tulsa, or Broken Arrow, close to. There's a lot of suburbs. Could one not argue, yes, but if you do this at scale, if we have lots of suburbs, some of them being built, some of them failing, isn't that sort of what you're talking about? We're just, instead of it being a microcosm of each individual house kind of being built or torn down on an individual basis, what's wrong with like, well, this neighborhood failed, but this one's being built up. And so therefore, in the grand scheme of things, we're actually accruing wealth.
It's funny because I've been talking about this for years, and I've never made that leap that you just made, which is really insightful. So the idea that as we build organic neighborhoods, some of the houses are in a state of disrepair. Some of them are very nice, and you're building up and tearing down, in a sense, evolving. What you're suggesting is that there's there's an analogous thing going on today, which is we're building up a new city over here, and this older city over here, or this older neighborhood over here, is completely falling apart. I think that's a profound insight that hadn't really occurred to me. So let's talk about this effect, because this was another one of those things that when I first recognized this, I'm like, wow, that's really powerful. Let's say we go out and build a new neighborhood and we build 400 homes. So there's a cornfield. I don't know what it would be in Tulsa, a wheat field out on the edge. So you got an open ground, and the developer goes out and builds that. If you read my first book, we talk about all the underlying subsidies and all the things that go into creating that. But let's ignore that for a moment and just look at the individual homes. We'll go out and build 400 homes. They're all built within like 3, 4, 5 years of each other. So, a nice steady rate. You got a brand new subdivision. It's got a new park. It's got all the, all the amenities. It's very nice. 25 years later, everybody's roof reaches the end of its life. 25, 30 years later, everybody's roof goes bad at the same time. Everybody's siding needs to be, if it's vinyl, replaced, or if it's, wood, needs to be repainted at the same time. Everybody's sidewalks start to crack and fall apart at the same time. So this place that was brand new has now kind of a ticking time bomb of decline that's built in, and it hits all at the same time. What that means is that everybody who lives in that development is forced to cough up the money to make all of this expensive maintenance happen. And I don't know if you own a home or not, but owning a home is just maintenance. It's just like every year, it's like, okay, in the last 3 years, we've replaced our furnace, we've painted our house. These were like massive investments that I wasn't planning to make, but like became obvious that I had to make in this house to maintain it. So all of a sudden, you've been able to live for decades with none of that really, because everything's new. And then all of a sudden, bam, big ticket item, big ticket item, big ticket item. And not just you, but like everybody around you. And so what happens is that people leave. And people of lesser financial means end up owning those homes. People of lesser financial means, because the house starts to, in a sense, decline in value. The neighborhood starts to decline in value relative to other neighborhoods. So affluent people decamp. If we go back to the traditional neighborhood, you would have had nice house next to a house falling apart, next to mid house. That middle one becomes an opportunity to, in a sense, bring it up to the quality of the neighborhood, because the neighborhood has nice homes in it. But if you're in a neighborhood of 400 homes, they're all like 30 years old now. They're kind of the older style. They're a little outdated. They're starting to fall apart. Yeah, there's a few people who are out doing things, but some of them aren't, just, because you get a group of 400 families and 40 of them are going to be in a bad position at any one time. So they're not going to be able to do the things. So their house is going to look run down. The other important thing to note here is that in the traditional neighborhood, buying the single family house and then redoing it with something probably wasn't redoing it with a single family house. It was probably making it into a duplex or a triplex or something that was more intense. Mm-hmm. And so the financial transaction actually made sense in a marketplace. When you're in a neighborhood of single family homes that's in decline, what our regulatory framework says is that you can only have single family homes in that neighborhood. And so the only thing that you can really do with it is either stop the decline or slow the decline by buying a declining house in a declining neighborhood and then trying to maintain it, or scrape it off and build a new single family home, which, if you're going to build a new single family home, why not build it in the nice new neighborhood where all the new nice single family homes are going? Why would you build it in this old rundown crappy neighborhood that's in decline? And so what you tend to see is that entire neighborhoods sink and fall, without any kind of condition to arrest them. And because these are huge places, you've got city water, sewer, roads, street, you got a whole city apparatus designed to sustain these things that require increasing property values and increasing tax rates and increasing, in a sense, affluence, where it's going in the opposite direction, you wind up in like the worst of all positions, where the city can't meet their obligations, the property owners can't meet their obligations, and everybody, while they kind of bought an individual home and their own individual American dream, are kind of subtly tied together in this decline. And it's just a really, really bad effect.
You saying that popped a question in my head that I don't quite understand, because there's a portion of the book where you talk about essentially zoning laws and regulations and to what extent they may be holding us back from further development or building. There's a lot of this stuff that I think makes a lot of sense. You can have all sorts of trade-offs. You can see why people of good faith passed certain requirements, I mean, something as simple as, hey, we don't like entire neighborhoods to burn to the ground just because somebody had a fire start accidentally. So why don't we build these things in such a manner that they're sort of fire retardant, if you will, or make them more resilient? A lot of the stuff I think, most people wouldn't argue with. What was the impetus behind restricting people from turning a single family home into something different, like a duplex or a triplex? Because that seemed to have a profound impact on the ability for a neighborhood to evolve. And it's probably just my own ignorance. I don't know why that's such a ubiquitous rule that you just cannot do this. Like, who is that harming?
Well, if we go to the like organic analogy, it would be like taking a human and saying you can't evolve from an adolescent to a preteen. Like, you have to stay as an adolescent forever, right? It just doesn't. You essentially start the ticking clock on decline. Why did we do this? I think is a really good question. We established zoning largely to, there's a lot of stories of zoning that go back to, planners tell themselves, oh, we were separating apartment buildings from meat rendering plants, and isn't it great? But the reality is that zoning as an institution really took off across this country in the 1930s and 1940s as part of the financial revolution in housing. So in the New Deal, we wanted to build homes or finance homes nationally instead of locally. So we could get, instead of that 3, 4, 5-year balloon payment mortgage, we could get a 20-year, 30-year mortgage, spread those payments out, keep people in their homes, allow people ultimately to pay more for their homes. Part of making that, I'm going to use air quotes here, a sound investment for the federal government, because this was the federal government now backing local housing. This was the federal government, in a sense, supplanting local banks and writing home loans. If the federal government to do that, they needed surety that these were, and I'm going to use air quotes again, good, quote, good neighborhoods.
Right.
This is where you get the whole idea of redlining.
Mm-hmm.
The thing that progressives have really been pounding on the last couple of decades for righteous reasons. They've been pounding on it. I mean, redlining was, in a lot of ways, you would say this is a good neighborhood, we will write loans here. This is a bad neighborhood, we will not write loans here. Sometimes those good and bad were made off of housing quality, but oftentimes they were made on the types of person that were there. So this is a white neighborhood, good. This is a black neighborhood, bad. But the federal government, in a sense, pushed cities to adopt zoning as a way to replicate this development pattern very, very, very quickly. There was never a law that said you have to have zoning, but if you wanted 30-year mortgages, you needed zoning. If you wanted, federal assistance on your infrastructure, you needed zoning. If you wanted, because zoning was like the framework that was going to, we call often suburban subdivisions like cookie cutter subdivisions, as if that's a derogatory thing. The reality is that the cookie cutter was the feature, not the flaw.
It probably goes without saying that I think, as a general observation, governments seek to commoditize things, right? They seek to make complex systems something that can be understood. Otherwise, they don't know how to regulate it. So it's nothing necessarily nefarious initially. I get why you would want to package these things in order to finance them.
That's exactly what it was. In fact, when you get to the late 1960s, early 1970s, the federal government creates Ginnie Mae and the first mortgage-backed security. So the federal government like pioneers the mortgage-backed security market. Mortgage-backed securities is basically like taking the mortgage payment from many, many different people, bundling them together. And the only way that works is if you have a standard product in California and Texas and Oklahoma and Minnesota and Florida and New York that you can bundle together. Well, okay, we want products that are zoned R1, single family zoning. We want them to be a certain minimum size. We want them to have a certain, fire rating. We want them, bam, bam, bam. You bundle them together and you get the mortgage-backed security. So zoning allowed you to commoditize and standardize this development of this product, the suburban subdivision. I think there became this kind of cultural overlay to it, right? So the marketing brochure that I bought into is a single family neighborhood with a white picket fence and, my own garage and like my own backyard and all this. You change the marketing brochure in a way when you start adding duplexes and triplexes and, God help us, apartment buildings and other things. That was like there's a certain social compact that I think people often look at as being broken when you do that, because I bought a neighborhood of single family homes. I did not buy a neighborhood of other types of buildings. And, I think progressives often say, well, that's, there's a racial component of that. I'm not going to deny that there might be in some cases. There might be a class component of it, because what we tend to do is here's a neighborhood of homes at one price point. Here's a neighborhood of homes at another price point. We segregate by price point our neighborhoods. And so you tend to be in neighborhoods of people who make similar amounts of money as you do. Again, that's very different than what you would have seen pre-Great Depression. I think we have just culturally kind of slid into this idea that zoning is here to protect us from the decline that is inevitable in every suburban subdivision. And I think that's the leap that people take, is that when that decline starts to slip in, which is inevitable, like we described, I think people look at zoning and they look at local government not as the way to like create the next cookie cutter, the next subdivision, the next thing, because that's what the federal government's looking at it as. As local government, we grab those same tools and we say, please stop this decline. Like restore my neighborhood to the original marketing brochure. Let's use the tools of government to enforce stasis that I can see with my own eyes is slipping away. And that I think is a really dysfunctional reaction, but I think it's a very human reaction as well.
Yeah, it's something that at scale is dysfunctional, but one can understand is also sensible for the individual that bought that home and said, well, I bought into this neighborhood because I thought it was going to provide me other neighbors like me, right? And so why would I allow that this is my investment. This is where I'm, choosing to live.
We'll follow you've asked this in an interesting way. So I feel like if we follow like the trajectory of one house, like let's look at two neighbors. We buy in 30 years ago. Now our houses have kind of reached their apex. They need serious maintenance. And I noticed that my neighbor's not maintaining theirs. And, maybe I'm a decent neighbor. I'm a good person. I go over and I try to help them a little bit. But there's a limit to what I can do. I can't pay to fix their roof, and I can't, I'll help them repaint, but like I can't, there's a limit. So the place starts to go into decline. In fact, a number of them in my neighborhood go into decline. Pre-Great Depression, a neighborhood that was dynamic would not have been built all at once like that, but a neighborhood that was dynamic, someone would come in and buy that house in decline and say, all right, I'm going to make it office in the front and a house in the back, and then I'll add another apartment on the second story. And that's the way I'll finance this kind of rehab of this building. Can't do that today. Nope, single family home neighborhood can't do that. I'm going to come in and buy it, and I'll put a cottage in the backyard, and nope, can't do that. So all of a sudden, all those things are off the table. what tends to happen then is that neighbor's house just goes bad. It just goes into decline. If you stick around long enough, some developer will come in, aggregate like 2 or 3 of those that are next to each other that are not doing well. They'll buy them up. Then they'll go in and say, to make this work, we need a rezoning. We need to tear all of these down, and we're going to build a 4-story, 5-story, 6-story apartment complex. And then everyone's like, wait a sec. I have a single family neighborhood. I don't want a 6-story apartment complex here. The reality is that, first of all, to make the financing work for the developer, that kind of big leap is what needs to happen, because you've not allowed any other leap to occur. So no other natural evolution has been able to happen. And the second thing is, again, the federal government has a financing mechanism for 4-story apartments that they don't have for duplexes and triplexes and houses with an office in front, or a place that would have a bodega on the side and a coffee shop and someone living in the back. Like, those things are not financeable in the same way that a 4-story, 5-story apartment would be. So all of a sudden, change in our neighborhoods becomes this dramatic, unrecognizable thing, backed by big Wall Street finance, federal government subsidies happening in our neighborhood. And what that does is it tends to reinforce the idea that we don't want any change at all, because the change that we get does not look like a natural evolution of a place. The change that we get is this dramatic, radical outside imposition of something very, very different.
Yeah, and I do. If we have time, definitely want to talk about NIMBYs. That's always the villain of many stories. The NIMBYs out there trying to prevent any change whatsoever. But I want to shelf that, because Saving Elephants, it's a conservative audience, but it's also, I try very much to speak to my generation, the millennials, because of the oversized influence I think that the 2008 housing collapse had on us financially, politically, probably philosophically and socially and psychologically. Your book does a very good job, I think, of, in just a handful of pages, trying to describe this thing that volumes of books have been written about. But the reason I'm bringing this up is because, and we've kind of danced around this throughout the entire conversation, the federal government's involvement in housing is such that housing was no longer just a shelter for people, nor was it just a place for me personally to have as an investment, kind of for my assets to increase. But we literally have gotten to the point in this country, and had, in the run up to 2008, where maybe I shouldn't say the government, but the financing markets needed us to buy houses. It was no longer, here's the great American dream, let's help Americans out so they can have houses. They even got to the point they were creating synthetic CDOs because there weren't enough people out there buying houses. So it's a big subject, but I wanted to open here to just ask, can you paint for me this picture? Why was it the financial market was so seemingly desperate for people to have houses in order to prop up essentially our economic system?
Let me go to that end of that first life cycle, that first generation of suburban expansion. So 1945, the troops come home and we start building suburbia. We have the GI Bill. We have all these programs that we put in place during the Great Depression to keep housing prices from dropping, deflationary spiral. And we repurpose those to make housing prices go up and to expand this suburban dream, create this American dream of suburban expansion. You get to 1970, you're 25 years into this experiment, and the economy starts to heave. It goes through a big inflationary cycle, and banks start to fail because local banks can't take on long-term mortgages. I mean, you can't. When interest rates go up, local banks have two options. They either slowly bleed to death because they're bringing in less interest from this long-term mortgage and they have to pay depositors, or they keep deposit rates low and they lose all their depositors, and then they just fail because they don't have any reserve money. So the federal government had to bail out banks in the end of the 1960s, early 1970s. This was kind of like the first bank bailout. It was small. They didn't call it a bailout. But basically what they did is they created Freddie Mac and they created Ginnie Mae to buy more mortgages from local banks. We will purchase these mortgages from you. You can unload them. We will take, in a sense, like the losing bets that we forced you to make, or that we induced you to make, we will take those off, and then you can write new mortgages that are at higher interest rates, and then that will fix your balance sheet, and you will be good. If you look then, there's this series of housing bubbles. There's another inflationary bubble in the 1970s. There's an S&L bubble in the 1980s. There is then the subprime bubble that starts in the mid 90s and really accelerates in the early 2000s and ends in 2008. In each of these bubbles, the financing of homes becomes more and more central to our economy. Because every time the federal government bails out banks, the way that the federal government does this is, in a sense, to borrow money, to backstop the riskier bets that banks are making. And there's a story of like evil banks here, but it's fascinating to me because it is not. I'm going to say, you create a bank because you want to make money, and like I understand that, and I have no problem with banks serving a function and making money. But at each instance, the banks that were the most reckless, the banks that did the worst kind of things, were over and over and over again rewarded by the federal government in a way that Grisham's law kind of suggests. The bad money drives out the good money. The bad investors drive out the good investors. The people who were kind of playing by the old rules become antiquated, and the new rules of securitization, more risk, more leverage, more insurance to try to backstop this thing. There's all these different products that end up in the 2000s to the point where you go out and buy a house and you think you are the consumer buying a house. You think you're the buyer, the house is the product. And the reality is that in our market, you are the customer. You are creating a mortgage. And that mortgage, whether it's backed, in 2000, in 2007, 2006, we were making up appraisals. We were making up, it was just insane. It was crazy because we just needed the piece of paper, because it was the piece of paper, the promise you make to devote 30 years of your earnings to paying a mortgage. That piece of paper could be combined with other similar promises into a bundle. That bundle could be cut up into different pieces. Each of those pieces then was a security that could be, as you said, hypothecated, made stacks of bets upon, traded all over. And what you saw was there was an unlimited demand for mortgages. And because of that, all of this liquidity, all of this money like poured into the mortgage market, and anyone who could originate a mortgage anywhere was given a loan. We just needed the paper so badly. And so you have, the 2008 bubble and the 2008 housing crisis, where, all of this kind of crazy paper is revealed for what it is, which is, some of them were good bets, some of them were horrible bets, but you had combined them in this elixir where you couldn't tell the difference between the two. And so all of these securities became toxic, to use their term. And what a disaster. I think we will look back at that as like another tremor. I did this map or chart of the Case-Shiller index, and I try to describe it as tremors, because you see this tremor in the 60s, this tremor in the 70s, tremor in the 80s, tremor in 2008. And of course, if you want to talk about it where we're at today, we are many multiples above where we were in 2008 in terms of the Case-Shiller index and prices being out of alignment with reality. So we are, in a sense, like the largest tremor is right now.
Yeah, it's, gosh, that's something to look forward to, I suppose. But this is a big topic, and I think it's one of those that, understandably, and I'm even this way, I get really frustrated with this topic because it feels like someone is deliberately trying to make things more confusing than they need to be. It is such a complex idea, and there's so many players involved. And you write in the book here, from top to bottom, the 2000s housing bubble feels like an orgy of consensual half-truths, deceit, outright fraud. And I think that's true. I think it's also true that people were probably acting rationally in their own best interest because the market was signaling things saying, hey, we need people to buy more houses in order to commoditize these, in order to sell them. That's how the economy has worked. It's how it's backstopped. And so, like, on the one hand, you could say this was a combination of stupidity and evil. On the other is like, well, but what is one of my favorite phrases from despair.com? No single raindrop believes it was responsible for the flood.
Yeah.
We kind of all were participating, and so I want to go back over a few of the things you talked about, because I think Fannie Mae and eventually we called it Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac, but Fannie Mae and Ginnie Mae, I guess at the time. I don't know if they were initially, but became known as GSEs, or government sponsored entities. I work in the auditing industry. We audit governments, and there was an interesting kind of debate sometimes, because the phrase that was often used was this government sponsored entity. It's not a government. It's an entity that is it's a for-profit entity that has some sort of backing from the federal government. And the big debate was, okay, is the backing implicit or explicit? Like, do the feds actually say, well, if the housing market starts to fail, we're going to come in and bail you out? And the reason I say that is because in our industry, we're having to disclose certain information. Exactly how risky is this thing? That's hard to answer when you can't get a straight answer from anyone. And I think the unfortunate answer to that question is we can't actually say, yes, we'll back anything, but we're not willing to not back anything, because if we don't and the market starts to collapse, our entire economy collapses.
Yeah, this is the tension, right? So in the 1930s, we created the Homeowners Loan Corporation. That was in the first 100 days of the New Deal. And what they were supposed to do, or what they did, is they went to local banks and they said, okay, instead of foreclosing on these people who are now trapped, recognize that those 3, 4, 5-year mortgages that were interest only, when they would come due in the Great Depression, housing prices had fallen in the Great Depression. And so the bank said, hey, we'll lend you, your loan is due, you got a balloon payment. The balloon payment is $1,000. Houses were way cheaper back then. $1,000. We will lend you, half of your home value, which your home value is dropped now. So we will lend you $800. You've got to come up with $200 in cash because you've got this balloon payment. And people couldn't do it because it was the Great Depression, and they got kicked out of their homes. They got foreclosed on. The Homeowners Loan Corporation went in and said to local banks, hey, don't foreclose on that house. What we want you to do instead is we want you to sell us that loan. So the federal government, will buy that loan. And then the federal government turned around to the property owners and said, hey, how would you like to stay in this house? And how would you like it if we refinance this for you over a little bit longer period of time? That was a really good deal for homeowners. It kept people in the houses. It made the banks whole. It tended to make the system work. Fannie Mae was an extension of that. And Fannie Mae, in a sense, was a secondary market where banks could, if they needed a little bit of cash, they need a little bit of liquidity, they own these long-term loans. Boy, we really don't like owning these long-term loans because, we can't adjust interest rates. We can't change things. What if we're stuck with this loan and we need some cash to bolster our reserves or do something else? So Fannie Mae was designed to have the federal government say, we will buy those loans from you. Over time, what happened is that the federal government wanted to, in a sense, get out of that business or / juice that business more. And the federal government would repay those loans with, if you were going to sell a loan, if you were a bank and you were going to sell a loan to Fannie Mae, instead of giving you cash for that loan, they would give you cash and equity in Fannie Mae. And so the idea was over time that the banks were going to own and, in a sense, own and finance this themselves. That had the effect of, again, government-sponsored entity, of making it a quasi-private public kind of thing where over time the shareholders, the owners of it, became the banks and the banking system, but the money put into it and the capital put into it was the government's. And there was government backing for it. When Freddie Mac was created, it was set up in a sense the same way as a GSE. Ginnie Mae was in different. a fully government-backed entity, and they were doing something slightly different, right? You get to the 1990s. At this point, we were just going all out. This was, a period of time where we were trying to create as many mortgages as we can, and the government backing part started to, in a sense, become less of an issue. There was, again, I'll go back to the redlining thing. If you meet these criteria, Ginnie Mae will buy it. If you meet these criteria, Fannie Mae will buy it. If you meet these criteria, Freddie Mac will buy it. The less government was involved in that, the more those rules kind of relaxed and changed. And now you had these GSEs buying subprime mortgages, things that you never would have bought in the 70s or 80s. You started to buy in the 90s and in the early 2000s. Way, way, way riskier loans. And of course, we're going to hedge our risk by getting insurance from places like AIG and others that are throwing out these insurance policies in bulk. And so it became like this repository of gambling. There was kind of an open question in the 2008 financial crisis, on what the federal government would do with Fannie and Freddie. Because there was an argument to be made that these were private entities with government backing, that the government should let them fail, like let them go bad. I think people stared into that abyss and recognized that this would be a disaster. Like things could not work out if they did that. And so, the other kind of argument that you made of Fannie Freddie is that, well, if the government's going to take all these losses, then these private shareholders need to take the losses, and the government needs to, in a sense, reacquire this company at fire sale prices, which is what they did. Fannie Freddie are now owned by, there are some private shareholders, but they are, in a sense, owned by the federal government.
You're listening to the Saving Elephants Show.
Thank you for listening to my conversation with Chuck Marohn. Now, if you're thinking, that's a very odd place to end the conversation, you would be right. We actually went on for quite a while after this, reliving and relitigating all the moves in the 2008 market collapse. And I would love to share that conversation with you, but alas, the podcast gods just would not let it happen. We had a lot of technical difficulties in the second half. And of course, we missed the entire, what do we do about all this? Now, in true conservative fashion, Chuck is very cautious about offering something that's an, air quote, solution to a grand problem of this nature. I mean, he does say, ultimately, to escape this housing trap, to get out of this cycle or this bubble we keep creating, we have to first overcome the basic contradiction that housing can be both affordable on the one hand and a good investment on the other. That it's more than just a store of wealth. That mortgages are still foundational to our entire financial economic system, and yet they're the worst kind of investment. Investors keep buying mortgages because they're a, air quotes, safe bet, and therefore the government is committed to keep propping them up. There may not be a direct solution, but there are ways in which we can begin to recognize this as a perpetuating problem and to return to older models of how we might live. I mean, my number one recommendation is just go out and buy the book. It's a good one. Escaping the Housing Trap by Charles Marohn. I'll have the links in the show notes, of course. And I'm not going to even bother to do it an injustice by giving a list of here's the things we ought to be doing that could get us out of this. But I do want to leave with one thought. As we were talking in this conversation, I don't think I mentioned Burke's name. I might have in the introduction, but I don't think I did with Chuck. But everything he's talking about is a relatively Burkean model for how we might even think about housing. The more Wilsonian FDR progressive model is the one we've been seeing, is the one we have lived through for the past many generations, and it has some merit to it. People do good things for good reasons in their self-interest and, one would hope, in the self-interest of others. But if they have a distorted view about the nature of humanity, ultimately these good things end up causing harm. Humans in a Burkean view are more than just complicated. We're complex. A watch is complicated. A living organism is complex. A living organism interacts with its environment around it. A living organism cannot simply be reduced to scientific laws like a contraption can. There is no such thing as gathering enough data that we can somehow crack the human machine and know how to build societies in such a way that we would resolve housing for everyone, make it affordable, make it a great investment, make it exactly what everyone needs. Because we're complicated organisms, we necessarily have to stumble upon these answers slowly, learn through process of time, and never have the hubris that when we've learned the lessons that somehow means we've cracked the code, but rather we might have found something that works here, but there are trade-offs to consider. We don't have the ability as humans to truly build a world or a nation or a community or even a neighborhood as some kind of a final end product that is capable of meeting all the demands, desires, and unanticipated disasters of the future. That kind of nimbleness requires a sort of evolutionary growth throughout society, a sort of response to the incalculable many needs of the individuals throughout time. That's why the free market works as well as it does. And in the same sense, we can't actually hack the human machine to build housing for ourselves that doesn't take into account our limited capacity for truly understanding the full complexity of humanity. This view of humanity that celebrates our complexity and our individuality and our variety, this is the conservative view. This is the view that I believe is the most durable and ultimately the most prosperous, because it fits human nature as it is, and not as we would hope it would be. And while often on this show we talk about how this view might translate or work at a national scale, I think it's equally important we recognize conservatism is scalable on down to the very root level. And certainly a good dose of sober conservatism is necessary if we are ever going to escape the housing trap.
Thanks for listening to the Saving Elephants podcast. Be sure and subscribe for future episodes. Do you have a topic or question about conservatism, millennials, the Republican Party, or anything else that you'd like us to cover in a future podcast? We would love to hear from you. Email us at savingelefantsblog@gmail.com. That is savingelefantsblog@gmail.com. You can find us on Facebook, Twitter, and catch our weekly Friday blog posts at savingelefantsblog.com. That is savingelefantsblog.com. Join us next time as we reignite conservatism for millennials.